Some people spend a lifetime searching for a place that feels like home. Caleb Walker wasn't looking for one anymore. On a cold October morning, a blanket of silver fog drifted across Highway 27, softening the rolling hills of northern Michigan into pale shadows. The road stretched empty for miles, carrying only the distant whisper of wind through maple trees already painted in gold and crimson. Caleb guided his aging Ford pickup through the mist, one hand resting on the steering wheel while the other absently scratched behind Ranger's ears. The 6-year-old German Shepherd sat upright in the passenger seat, alert as always, his amber eyes fixed on something beyond the windshield. Since returning from the army years ago, Caleb had learned to trust the dog more than his own instincts. Ranger noticed things people missed. The truck rumbled past an abandoned gas station and a weather-worn church before the dog's ears suddenly snapped forward. Then came 3 sharp barks. Not frantic, not fearful, deliberate. Caleb's grip tightened on the wheel. Ranger only used that signal when something mattered. Through the fog, a faint figure emerged near the shoulder of the road. An elderly woman stood alone beside a stalled sedan, her coat fluttering in the cold wind like a forgotten flag. Caleb eased off the gas and pulled over. He had no way of knowing that this simple act of kindness would lead him to a forgotten hotel, a hidden legacy, and a future he never imagined could belong to him. Caleb stepped out into the cold air, his boots crunching softly against the gravel shoulder as the fog drifted across the road in slow waves. Up close, the woman appeared to be in her late 70s, her silver hair tucked beneath a knitted hat the color of winter clouds. Despite the chill, there was a calm dignity about her, the kind carried by people who had weathered many seasons and learned not to fear the storm. Her sedan sat quietly beside the road with its hood slightly raised, a thin ribbon of steam curling into the morning air. "Looks like you could use a hand," Caleb said. The woman smiled warmly. "I was beginning to think the road had forgotten me." Her voice was gentle, touched by the softness of another era. Caleb inspected the engine while Ranger circled the vehicle once before settling near the driver's door. The dog remained unusually attentive, his amber eyes following every movement the woman made. After a few minutes, Caleb discovered a loose battery connection and tightened it with a small wrench from his truck. The engine started immediately. The woman laughed quietly, the sound blending with the whisper of wind through nearby trees. "You make it look easy." Caleb shrugged. "Spent enough years fixing things that refused to cooperate." The woman studied him for a moment, not in the way strangers usually looked at one another, but as if she were trying to remember something half forgotten. "Thank you," she said. Most people would have kept driving. Caleb wiped his hands on a faded shop rag. Someone would have stopped eventually. Her smile deepened slightly. Perhaps. But sometimes the right person arrives instead. Ranger suddenly stood and walked toward her. Caleb watched carefully. The shepherd was friendly, but cautious. Yet now he approached without hesitation and gently rested his head against the woman's coat. For several seconds neither moved. The woman reached down and scratched behind his ears. Ranger closed his eyes as though greeting an old friend. "Well," she whispered, "you are a remarkable fellow." Then she reached beneath her scarf and adjusted something hanging around her neck. For a brief moment, the fog shifted, and Caleb caught sight of an antique brass key suspended from a worn leather cord. It was larger than any ordinary key, its surface darkened by age. The intricate design along the handle looked almost handcrafted. Before he could ask about it, the woman tucked it back beneath her coat. "My name is Eleanor Brooks," she said. "There is a diner about 5 miles from here. If you are heading north, I would like to buy breakfast for the man who saved my morning." Caleb almost declined out of habit. Pride had a way of surviving long after comfort disappeared. But something in Eleanor's expression felt sincere, and the smell of fresh coffee suddenly sounded appealing. 20 minutes later they sat near a window overlooking a small lake wrapped in autumn colors. Outside, the water shimmered beneath the pale sunlight. Inside, the scent of maple syrup, bacon, and fresh biscuits filled the room. Eleanor wrapped both hands around a mug of tea while Ranger rested beneath the table. For a while they spoke about ordinary things. The changing leaves, the early frost, small towns that seemed forgotten by time. Then Eleanor glanced toward the distant hills beyond the lake and grew quiet. Her eyes lingered there longer than necessary. "There are places," she said softly, almost to herself, that spend years waiting for someone brave enough to remember them. Caleb followed her gaze, but all he saw were forests, rolling ridges, and drifting clouds. Still, something about the way she said it caused a faint chill to move through him. And beneath the table, Ranger slowly lifted his head and listened. The diner gradually filled with the quiet sounds of a small American town waking up. Plates clinked softly. A waitress refilled coffee cups. Sunlight pushed through the fog outside and painted long golden reflections across the lake. Yet despite the warmth around him, Caleb could not shake the feeling that something unusual lingered beneath the surface of the morning. Eleanor seemed perfectly ordinary one moment and strangely distant the next, as though part of her attention remained fixed on a place far away. She stirred her tea slowly and smiled whenever people greeted her, but several times Caleb noticed her eyes drifting back toward the northern hills beyond the water. Ranger noticed it too. The German shepherd remained unusually alert beneath the table, his ears twitching whenever Eleanor spoke about the past. Eventually, she set down her cup and folded her hands together. "Do you ever feel like certain places remember people?" she asked. Caleb gave a faint smile. "I am not sure places remember much of anything." Eleanor looked out the window. "I used to think that too." For a moment, neither spoke. Outside, a flock of geese crossed the pale autumn sky. Their distant calls echoed across the lake like voices carried by the wind. Then Eleanor reached into her coat pocket and removed a small photograph. The edges were worn and faded from decades of handling. She slid it across the table toward him. Caleb picked it up carefully. The photograph showed a grand stone building standing atop a ridge overlooking a forest valley. Its architecture belonged to another era, elegant and proud. Wide porches wrapped around the structure. Tall windows reflected sunlight. A wooden sign near the entrance was partially visible, though the lettering had become too faded to read. "Beautiful place," Caleb said. Eleanor nodded. "It was once the heart of an entire community." A shadow passed through her eyes. Time changes everything. Before he could ask another question, she gently took the photograph back and slipped it into her pocket. The movement felt deliberate, as though she had already revealed more than intended. Ranger suddenly rose from beneath the table and walked to her side. Without hesitation, he rested his nose against her hand. Eleanor smiled softly and scratched behind his ears. "You know," she whispered to the dog, "some journeys begin long before we realize we are on them." Caleb frowned slightly. The words sounded less like conversation and more like a memory. When breakfast ended, they stepped outside into crisp autumn air scented with pine and fallen leaves. The lake shimmered beneath the morning sun. Eleanor thanked him once again and walked toward her sedan. Before climbing inside, she paused. Her fingers briefly touched the antique brass key hidden beneath her scarf. Then she looked directly at Caleb. "If life ever offers you a road that makes no sense at all," she said quietly, "take it anyway." The statement caught him off guard. "That sounds risky." A faint laugh escaped her. "The safest roads rarely lead anywhere worth remembering." She closed the door and drove away, disappearing down the highway until her taillights vanished among the trees. Caleb stood watching for several moments. Something about the encounter felt unfinished, as though a door had opened somewhere beyond sight, but had not yet revealed what waited behind it. Beside him, Ranger remained focused on the empty road long after the car disappeared. Then, the dog gave a single low whine and stared toward the distant northern hills where clouds drifted above the forested ridges. Whatever had captured his attention was far away, but it was waiting. 3 days passed. Autumn settled deeper across northern Michigan, painting the forests in shades of amber and crimson while cold winds swept across the lakes. Caleb returned to the familiar rhythm of small repair jobs, sleeping in his truck when work was scarce, and following whatever road promised another day of honest labor. Yet Eleanor's words lingered in his thoughts like a song he could not quite remember. More than once he found himself staring toward the northern hills, wondering why a stranger's brief conversation felt impossible to forget. Ranger seemed affected as well. The German shepherd spent long stretches gazing toward the horizon, ears lifting at sounds too distant for human hearing. On the 4th morning, the sky hung low with gray clouds. A light rain tapped softly against the windshield while Caleb sat parked beside a hardware store drinking coffee from a paper cup. Ranger suddenly lifted his head. The dog stared toward the street, and released a single low sound from deep in his throat. Not a warning. Recognition. Caleb followed his gaze. A dark sedan had stopped across the street. A man in a charcoal overcoat stepped out carrying a leather briefcase. He looked around before crossing directly toward Caleb's truck. There was something formal about him, something that belonged in courtrooms and office buildings rather than small-town parking lots. The man stopped beside the driver's window. Caleb Walker? Caleb lowered the glass slightly. Depends who is asking. The man offered a polite smile. My name is Richard Harlan. I am an attorney representing the estate of Eleanor Brooks. The world seemed to pause for a moment. Even the rain felt quieter. Caleb set down his coffee. Estate. The attorney nodded solemnly. I am afraid Mrs. Brooks passed away 2 days ago. The words settled heavily between them. Caleb looked away toward the wet pavement. He had only known her for a few hours, yet the news carried an unexpected sadness. Some people left an impression larger than the time they occupied. Eleanor had been one of them. Ranger rested his chin against the door and stared at the attorney with unusual focus. Richard opened his briefcase and removed a large envelope sealed with dark blue wax. Mrs. Brooks left specific instructions that this be delivered to you personally. Caleb frowned. There must be some mistake. There is not. The attorney handed him the envelope. Written across the front in elegant handwriting were the words, for Caleb Walker. Caleb recognized the script immediately. His pulse quickened. Why me? Richard glanced toward the cloudy sky. That is a question Mrs. Brooks anticipated. He removed a second document and handed it over. You have also been requested to attend a reading tomorrow morning. Caleb studied the papers. Confusion mixed with disbelief. I barely knew her. The attorney's expression softened. Sometimes people know exactly what they are doing. With that, he returned to his car and drove away. Rain continued falling softly. The envelope rested in Caleb's hands. Ranger nudged it gently with his nose. The dog seemed almost impatient. After a long moment, Caleb carefully broke the wax seal. Inside was a folded letter and something heavier wrapped in cloth. He unfolded the letter first. The handwriting was unmistakably Eleanor's. The message was brief. Caleb, if you are reading this, then the road has already begun. There is something waiting in the north. Trust the dog. Trust the key. And when the time comes, do not turn back. Beneath the note lay an antique brass key attached to a worn leather cord. The same key Eleanor had carried around her neck. Caleb stared at it while a cold breeze rattled the rain against the glass. Beside him, Ranger sat perfectly still, eyes fixed on the key as if he recognized it. Somewhere beyond the distant hills, hidden among forests and forgotten years, a door was waiting to be opened. The reading took place the following morning in a brick building overlooking the town square. Rain clouds drifted low across the sky, turning the windows silver with reflected light. Caleb sat quietly at the far end of a polished oak table while Ranger rested beside his chair. The room smelled faintly of old paper, coffee, and cedar shelves worn smooth by time. Only a handful of people attended. 2 distant relatives. A banker. The attorney. No one seemed surprised to see one another. Yet several glanced curiously toward Caleb, as though trying to understand why a stranger had been invited. Richard Harlan opened a folder and began reading through the final wishes Eleanor had left behind. Most of it sounded ordinary. Donations to local charities. Gifts to longtime friends. Small pieces of a life carefully distributed among people she had cared about. Then the attorney paused. The room grew noticeably quieter. Even the ticking clock on the wall seemed louder. Richard adjusted his glasses and continued. Eleanor Brooks bequeaths ownership of the Silver Pines Hotel and all associated property to Caleb Walker. For several seconds no one moved. Caleb blinked. He was certain he had heard incorrectly. A hotel. The words felt unreal. One of the relatives shifted uncomfortably. Another frowned in confusion. Richard calmly slid several documents across the table. The transfer is legal and fully documented. Caleb stared at the papers. Attached to the front was a photograph. The same building Eleanor had shown him at the diner. The stone structure standing proudly atop a forested ridge. Suddenly he recognized it. Silver Pines. The name had once been visible beneath years of fading sunlight. I do not understand, Caleb said quietly. Richard nodded as though expecting the reaction. Mrs. Brooks anticipated that as well. He handed over another envelope. Inside was a handwritten note. Caleb unfolded it carefully. The message contained only a few lines. Some places disappear because people stop believing they matter. Silver Pines has waited a very long time. Follow the road north. Trust what Ranger sees. The rest will reveal itself. Caleb read the words twice. Something stirred deep inside him. Not excitement. Not greed. Something quieter. A feeling that the road ahead had already begun long before he realized it. An hour later, he and Ranger were driving north through miles of autumn wilderness. Forests stretched across the landscape like waves of gold and copper. Narrow roads wound between hills wrapped in pine and maple. The farther they traveled, the fewer signs of civilization remained. Small towns faded behind them. Cell service vanished. Even the radio dissolved into static. By late afternoon, they reached a weathered sign, nearly hidden by overgrown branches. Silver Pines Road. The letters were faded almost beyond recognition. Ranger immediately sat upright. His ears pointed forward. His entire posture changed. Caleb turned onto the narrow road. Fallen leaves swirled behind the truck as they climbed steadily into higher ground. The forest thickened. Shadows stretched longer beneath the trees. After nearly 6 miles, the road curved around a ridge. Then Caleb saw it. Standing above the valley, half hidden by towering pines and decades of silence, rose the grand stone hotel from the photograph. The building appeared untouched by time and yet abandoned by it. Tall windows reflected the fading sunlight. Weathered balconies overlooked the forest below. A rusted sign hung crookedly above the entrance. The sight stole his breath, but it was Ranger's reaction that unsettled him most. The German shepherd stepped from the truck, stared at the darkened upper floors, and released a low whine. Then he fixed his gaze on a single third-floor window. A window where, for the briefest moment, Caleb could have sworn he saw a light flicker before vanishing completely. The sun slipped behind the ridge as evening settled over the valley. Shadows gathered beneath the towering pines, and the old building seemed to grow larger with every passing minute. Caleb stood near the entrance, studying the weathered stone walls, while Ranger remained fixed on the third-floor window. The light had vanished, yet the dog refused to look away. A cold breeze carried the scent of pine needles, damp earth, and something older, the faint smell of wood that had endured generations of seasons. Caleb removed the brass key from his pocket. The metal felt strangely warm despite the cooling air. The heavy front door stood closed beneath a rusted lantern. For a moment he hesitated. Then he stepped forward and inserted the key into the lock. The mechanism resisted at first. Years of silence seemed to hold it in place. Then a deep click echoed through the doorway. Slowly the door swung inward. Dust drifted through the fading light like tiny floating stars. Inside, the lobby stretched before him in near darkness. A grand staircase curved toward the upper floors. Chandeliers hung motionless from the ceiling. Tall windows reflected the last traces of sunset. Despite decades of abandonment, the place retained an undeniable dignity. It felt less like a ruin and more like something patiently waiting to awaken. Ranger entered first. His paws clicked softly against the hardwood floor as he moved through the lobby. Caleb followed, sweeping a flashlight beam across old furniture draped in white sheets. The light revealed a reception desk, faded paintings, and a stone fireplace large enough to warm an entire room. Everything appeared frozen in time. Then Ranger stopped. His ears rose. The dog turned toward the staircase. Without a sound, he began climbing. Caleb followed. The second floor revealed a long hallway lined with guest rooms. Dust covered every surface. Yet something felt unusual. The air seemed cleaner than expected, almost as though someone had passed through recently. Ranger continued upward. The third floor greeted them with silence, so complete Caleb could hear the faint ticking of his own watch. Moonlight filtered through narrow windows, painting silver rectangles across the floorboards. Ranger moved down the hallway with purpose. Not searching, leading. Finally, he stopped outside a room at the far end. The door stood slightly open. Caleb pushed it wider. Inside sat a simple suite overlooking the valley. A rocking chair faced the window. An antique lamp rested on a small table beside it. Nothing appeared remarkable until Ranger crossed directly to the far wall and began scratching at the wooden paneling. Once, twice, 3 deliberate scrapes. Caleb approached. The wall looked ordinary at first glance. Then his flashlight revealed a narrow seam hidden between the boards. His pulse quickened. Carefully he pressed against the panel. Nothing happened. Ranger whined softly and placed one paw against a small brass fixture nearly invisible beneath decades of dust. Caleb pressed it. A quiet mechanical sound echoed inside the wall. Slowly, almost reluctantly, part of the panel shifted inward. Behind it appeared a narrow compartment concealed from sight. Inside rested a leather journal, a bundle of yellowed documents tied with blue ribbon, and a framed photograph. Caleb picked up the photograph first. It showed Eleanor standing in front of the hotel many years younger, surrounded by dozens of smiling families. Written across the bottom in fading ink were 6 words. The Keepers of Silver Pines. Ranger sat beside him watching silently. Caleb opened the journal. On the first page, written in Eleanor's unmistakable handwriting, was a single sentence. If you have found this, the real story can finally begin. Caleb carried the journal downstairs and settled beside the massive stone fireplace in the lobby. Night had fully arrived beyond the tall windows. Moonlight silvered the valley outside while wind whispered through the pines surrounding the property. Ranger lay nearby, his head resting on his paws, though his ears remained alert. Every so often the dog glanced toward the upper floors as if listening to sounds hidden beyond ordinary hearing. Caleb opened the journal carefully. The leather creaked with age. The first pages contained entries written nearly 50 years earlier. Eleanor described a thriving mountain community built around the hotel. Families gathered there for weddings, holidays, and summer festivals. Children played on the hillsides. Travelers crossed 3 states just to spend a weekend among the forests and lakes. Yet as Caleb continued reading, the tone gradually changed. Businesses closed. Roads were rerouted. Economic hardships spread through the region. One by one the families left. Entire neighborhoods disappeared beneath weeds and silence. Still, a small group refused to abandon the valley. Eleanor called them the Keepers of Silver Pines. Caleb turned another page. Tucked between the entries was an old map marked with dozens of handwritten names. Beside each name appeared an address and a date. Many of the dates stretched back decades. He frowned. None of it made sense yet. Then he discovered a folded document hidden near the center of the journal. It was a property ledger. As he studied it, his confusion deepened. Hundreds of acres surrounding the hotel had never been sold. They remained tied to a trust established generations earlier. The signatures revealed ownership shared among dozens of local families. Families that no longer seemed to exist. A sudden scratching sound echoed from somewhere above. Caleb looked up immediately. Ranger was already standing. The dog stared toward the ceiling. The sound came again. Faint. Brief. Almost like wood settling. Yet the rhythm felt strangely deliberate. Ranger moved toward the grand staircase without hesitation. Caleb grabbed his flashlight and followed. They climbed to the 3rd floor once more. The hallway stood empty beneath pale moonlight. Silence returned. Then Ranger began walking. He passed the hidden room and continued farther down the corridor toward a section Caleb had not explored. At the very end stood a locked door painted dark green. The dog stopped there and sat. Caleb examined the handle. Another brass lock. Different from the others. He reached into his pocket and felt Eleanor's antique key. Something told him to try it. The key slid smoothly into place. The lock opened with a soft click. Beyond the door waited a small archive room lined with shelves from floor to ceiling. Dust covered everything. Boxes, ledgers, photographs, stacks of letters tied with faded ribbon. It looked less like storage and more like a memory preserved in secret. Caleb opened the nearest box. Inside were hundreds of envelopes addressed to former residents of the valley. Most had never been mailed. He opened one at random. The letter contained legal records proving ownership of land that families believed they had lost decades earlier. Another envelope contained similar documents. Then another, and another. The realization settled slowly. Eleanor had spent years protecting evidence. Evidence that an entire community still had rightful claims to property they thought had vanished forever. Caleb looked around the room in disbelief. This was never about a hotel. The building was only the guardian of something far greater. Ranger approached a nearby window overlooking the sleeping valley. In the distance, scattered lights glowed from small homes hidden among the trees. Families still lived here. Families who had no idea that the past was waiting for them inside these walls. And for the first time since arriving, Caleb began to understand why Eleanor had chosen him. Morning arrived beneath a sky washed clean by overnight rain. Sunlight spilled across the valley in long golden bands, illuminating forests that seemed to stretch forever beyond the ridge. Caleb stood on the hotel's front porch holding a box of documents while rangers sat beside him, watching the narrow road below. The world felt different now, not because he owned the property, but because he finally understood the responsibility Eleanor had left behind. For decades, she had protected the records hidden inside those walls. Now the task belonged to him. Over the next several days, Caleb began contacting names listed throughout the archive. Many calls ended with confusion. Some people thought he was mistaken. Others believed the records had been lost generations ago. Yet one by one, they agreed to visit. The first family arrived on a cool Thursday afternoon. An elderly farmer named Walter Hayes stepped from an aging pickup truck with his daughter and grandson beside him. Caleb welcomed them into the lobby and carefully presented the documents connected to their name. Walter adjusted his glasses and studied the pages in silence. His weathered hands trembled slightly. According to the records, nearly 60 acres bordering a nearby stream had always belonged to his family. The land had never been legally transferred away. It had simply disappeared beneath decades of paperwork and forgotten filings. Tears gathered in the old man's eyes. He removed his hat and looked around the lobby as though seeing the hotel for the first time. "My grandfather used to talk about this place," he whispered. Nobody believed him anymore. By the end of the week, more families arrived. Some traveled from neighboring towns. Others drove several hours after receiving Caleb's calls. Each story seemed connected to the next. A lost deed. A forgotten trust. Property records preserved by Eleanor long after everyone else had given up hope. The hotel slowly filled with voices again. Children explored the hallways. Grandparents shared memories beside the fireplace. Laughter echoed through rooms that had known only silence for decades. One evening, as sunset painted the mountains in amber light, Caleb discovered another envelope hidden inside Eleanor's journal. He had overlooked it before. The paper felt fragile with age. Inside was a final letter addressed directly to him. He unfolded it carefully and began to read. "Caleb, if you have reached this point, then Silver Pines is alive again. That was always the true inheritance. Not the building, not the land. Hope. Communities disappear when people forget they belong to one another. This hotel was never meant to make anyone wealthy. It was meant to remind people that kindness leaves roots deeper than time. You stopped your truck for a stranger because it was the right thing to do. That is why I trusted you. Not with property, but with purpose." Caleb lowered the letter slowly. For several moments, he simply stared across the valley. Below him, families gathered near the entrance, sharing stories beneath strings of temporary lights. Children chased one another across the lawn. Elderly neighbors reunited after years apart. Ranger approached quietly and rested his head against Caleb's side. The German shepherd gazed toward the crowd as though satisfied with something only he fully understood. And for the first time since arriving, Caleb realized the mystery had never been hidden in the walls. It had been waiting inside the people who were finally finding their way home. Winter arrived gently in the valley that year. Snow settled across the rooftops, softened the winding roads, and draped the surrounding pines in white silence. Yet unlike the years before, warmth now lived behind the stone walls on the ridge. Light glowed from every window each evening, casting golden reflections across the snow-covered grounds below. What had once stood forgotten now breathed with life again. Months passed. Families continued returning to reclaim pieces of their history. Old friendships were restored. Community gatherings filled the dining hall. Children laughed in corridors that had spent decades listening only to the wind. Caleb never tried to turn the place into something grand. He simply repaired what needed repairing. He fixed broken railings, restored fireplaces, patched roofs, and welcomed anyone who arrived with a story connected to the valley. Somehow that proved enough. One quiet December evening, the first annual Winter Lantern Gathering brought nearly the entire community together. Hundreds of lanterns lined the pathways leading to the entrance. Their warm glow flickered against the snow like stars scattered across the earth. Music drifted through the air. Neighbors shared meals. Elderly residents told stories beside the great stone fireplace, while children listened with wide eyes. Caleb stood on the front porch watching it all unfold. The cold air carried the scent of pine, wood smoke, and fresh bread from the kitchen. For a long moment, he simply listened. Not to silence, to belonging. Ranger sat beside him, older now, but no less watchful. The German shepherd surveyed the gathering with calm satisfaction. His amber eyes reflected the lantern light. Caleb smiled and scratched behind the dog's ears. "You knew before I did, didn't you?" he whispered. Ranger responded with a slow wag of his tail. As the evening continued, Walter Hayes approached carrying a small wooden box. The elderly farmer handed it to Caleb without explanation. Inside rested a brass plaque carefully polished until it gleamed. Engraved across its surface were simple words. "For those who chose to stay." Caleb looked up in surprise. Walter smiled. That place saved a lot more than property records. Around them, families laughed together beneath strings of lights stretching across the courtyard. The hotel no longer belonged to the past. It belonged to the future. Later that night, after the last lantern dimmed and the final guests returned home, Caleb walked through the quiet lobby one final time before bed. Snow drifted beyond the windows. Firelight danced across the stone walls. Everything felt peaceful, complete. He paused beside the reception desk where a framed photograph now stood. Eleanor smiled from within the picture, surrounded by the original keepers of Silver Pines. Caleb touched the frame gently. "Thank you," he said softly. A faint gust rattled the windows. Somewhere above, an old floorboard creaked. Not lonely, not mysterious. Familiar, almost comforting. Ranger stretched out near the fireplace and closed his eyes. Caleb settled into a chair overlooking the valley below. Beyond the glass, lights twinkled from homes scattered among the trees. Families were together. Histories had been restored. Hope had returned. And as snow continued falling beneath the quiet stars, Caleb finally understood something Eleanor had known all along. Sometimes the greatest inheritance is not a building, a deed, or a fortune. Sometimes it is simply being given a place where your story can begin again.